The heat inside the Ia Drang Valley rose from the jungle floor like a living thing on that November morning in 1965. Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore stepped off the helicopter into the tall elephant grass of Landing Zone X-ray, with his senses fully alert to the danger surrounding his men. The air was thick with the humidity of the central highlands and the deafening roar of rotor blades cutting through the heavy atmosphere. This was not merely a patrol mission, but the first major pitched battle between the United States Army and the People's Army of Vietnam. The ground beneath their boots felt solid, yet the surrounding dense foliage concealed thousands of waiting enemy soldiers who knew every inch of this terrain. Within minutes, the silence of the valley shattered as mortar rounds and machine gun fire erupted from the tree line. The American soldiers found themselves surrounded and outnumbered by a determined enemy that seemed to vanish and reappear at will. Young men who had trained in the pine forests of Georgia were now fighting for their lives in a landscape that felt alien and hostile. The noise was overwhelming as commands were shouted over the chaotic symphony of combat. Dust and smoke obscured the sun, turning the day into a gray nightmare. This battle would set the tone for the entire conflict, proving that superior firepower alone could not easily dislodge an enemy fighting on their own soil. The stakes in this remote valley extended far beyond the immediate survival of the men on the ground. Washington and the world were watching closely to see if the strategy of air mobility and massive troop deployment could halt the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. A defeat here would signal a failure of American military doctrine and potentially cause the collapse of South Vietnam. The domino theory was the prevailing fear in the halls of the White House, suggesting that if one nation fell to communism, the neighbors would inevitably follow. The lives of these soldiers were the currency with which the United States government hoped to purchase global stability. At the center of this escalating storm stood President Lyndon B. Johnson, a man torn between his domestic dreams of a great society and the nightmare of a foreign war. He had inherited a simmering conflict from his predecessors, but the decision to commit combat troops was his burden to bear. Johnson believed that American credibility was on the line, and that withdrawing would show weakness to the Soviet Union and China. He relied heavily on his advisors and General William Westmoreland, who assured him that victory was a matter of mathematics and body counts. Yet the president harbored deep private doubts about whether a Western power could ever truly win a land war in Asia. The central question that haunted the administration and the commanders on the ground was whether military might could win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. Could the United States bomb a determined insurgency into submission without destroying the very society it aimed to save? The war was not just about territory, but about political will and the endurance of the population. As the conflict dragged on, this question would become increasingly difficult to answer. The disparity between the optimistic reports sent to Washington and the grim reality of the jungle warfare created a credibility gap that would eventually widen into a chasm. The roots of this tragedy stretched back to the end of the Second World War and the collapse of French colonialism. The French had fought for years to maintain control over Indochina, but suffered a humiliating defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. The Geneva Accords temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, with the communist forces of Ho Chi Minh in the north and a Western-backed government in the south. The United States stepped into the void left by the French, hoping to build a viable nation in the south that could resist communist infiltration. It was a policy built on hope and fear, rather than a deep understanding of Vietnamese history and culture. Ho Chi Minh was a figure of immense nationalistic pride, for many Vietnamese having fought against Japanese occupiers and French colonizers. He viewed the United States not as a liberator, but as another imperial power standing in the way of national unification. His forces in the north and the Viet Cong guerrillas in the south were patient and willing to absorb tremendous losses to achieve their goal. They built vast networks of underground tunnels and utilized the Ho Chi Minh Trail to move supplies and men through the jungles of Laos and Cambodia. Their strategy was one of attrition, aiming to bleed the American forces until the public back home demanded an end to the war. The spark that fully ignited American involvement came in August 1964 in the Gulf of Tonkin. Reports reached Washington that North Vietnamese patrol boats had attacked the United States destroyer USS Maddox. Although the details of the second attack were murky and later proven to be largely non-existent, the incident provided the political justification Johnson needed. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution with near unanimity, granting the president broad powers to conduct military operations without a formal declaration of war. This resolution was the blank check that would fund the escalation of the conflict for years to come. By 1965, the United States began a massive bombing campaign known as Operation Rolling Thunder. The objective was to destroy the infrastructure of North Vietnam and cut off the supply lines to the south. B-52 bombers dropped millions of tons of ordnance, turning vast swathes of jungle and farmland into cratered wastelands. Despite the overwhelming destruction, the flow of supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail never completely stopped. The bombing stiffened the resolve of the North Vietnamese population and provided them with a powerful propaganda tool against the American aggressors. The air war was a blunt instrument trying to solve a delicate political problem. On the ground, the war was defined by the strategy of search and destroy. American platoons would venture out from fortified firebases into the dense bush to locate enemy units. Once contact was made, they would call in artillery and airstrikes to eliminate the threat. Success was measured not by land captured, but by the body count of enemy dead. This metric encouraged aggressive tactics and often led to inflated numbers as commanders sought to show progress. For the soldiers humping through the jungle, it meant walking into ambushes day after day with no clear front line to define safety. The environment itself was a formidable adversary for the young Americans. They contended with sweltering heat that caused heat exhaustion and dehydration, along with monsoon rains that turned the ground into thick mud. The jungle was alive with insects, leeches, and venomous snakes. Malaria and other tropical diseases took a heavy toll on the troops, often incapacitating as many men as enemy fire. The psychological strain of fighting an elusive enemy who used booby traps and ambushes created a constant state of anxiety. Every step on a jungle trail could trigger a mine or a punji stick trap. Back in the United States, the selective service system, or the draft, became a focal point of growing unrest. Every young man was required to register when he turned 18. However, the system was riddled with inequities that allowed college students and those with political connections to obtain deferments. This meant that the burden of the fighting fell disproportionately on the working class and minority communities. As the casualty lists grew longer and the coffins began to return home, resentment towards the draft system intensified. It became a symbol of a government that was willing to sacrifice its least privileged citizens for a questionable cause. The Vietnam War was the first conflict to be broadcast nightly into American living rooms. Television crews had unprecedented access to the battlefield, capturing the raw brutality of combat. Families gathered around their sets to watch reports from Walter Cronkite and other journalists who showed burning villages and wounded soldiers. This uncensored coverage stripped away the romanticism of war and exposed the public to the grim reality. The disparity between the optimistic official press briefings and the bloody footage on the evening news fueled a growing skepticism about the progress of the war. By 1967, the anti-war movement had transformed from a fringe group of intellectuals and pacifists into a mass social phenomenon. College campuses became hotbeds of dissent, with students organizing teach-ins and burning their draft cards in public acts of defiance. The movement brought together a diverse coalition, including civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., who famously spoke out against the war in his Beyond Vietnam speech. He argued that the war was draining resources from domestic social programs and sending young black men to die for liberties they did not enjoy at home. General Westmoreland returned to Washington in late 1967 to bolster public support. He famously declared that the end begins to come into view and that there was light at the end of the tunnel. The administration launched a public relations campaign to convince the American people that the communists were weakening and that victory was within reach. This optimism would prove to be disastrously premature. The enemy was not on the verge of collapse, but was instead preparing for a massive, coordinated assault that would shatter the illusion of American control. In late January 1968, during the Lunar New Year holiday known as Tet, a truce was traditionally observed. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong used this cover to launch the Tet Offensive, a simultaneous attack on over 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam. They struck at the heart of American power, even breaching the walls of the United States Embassy in Saigon. The sheer scale and ferocity of the offensive caught the American and South Vietnamese forces completely by surprise. It was a bold gamble intended to spark a general uprising among the population. The fighting during the Tet Offensive was some of the most intense of the entire war. In the ancient city of Hue, Marines and soldiers fought house to house for weeks to retake the citadel from communist forces. The urban combat was brutal and destructive, leaving much of the historic city in ruins. Although the American and South Vietnamese forces eventually repelled the attacks and inflicted heavy casualties on the Viet Cong, the political damage was irreversible. The offensive proved that despite years of bombing and hundreds of thousands of troops, the enemy was still capable of striking anywhere at any time. The psychological impact of the Tet Offensive on the American public was profound. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, visited Vietnam in the aftermath and concluded that the war was mired in a stalemate. His assessment shocked President Johnson, who reportedly said that if he had lost Cronkite, he had lost the middle class. The credibility of the administration was in tatters. The narrative of inevitable victory had been exposed as a fabrication. Support for the war plummeted as more Americans began to question the purpose and the cost of the conflict. Facing plummeting approval ratings and a rebellion within his own party, Lyndon Johnson made a stunning announcement in March 1968. He declared that he would not seek nor accept the nomination of his party for another term as president. The war had consumed his presidency and destroyed his political career. This announcement threw the 1968 election into chaos. The nation was deeply divided, with riots erupting in major cities following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and later Robert Kennedy. The fabric of American society seemed to be tearing apart. The horrors of the war were further exposed with the revelation of the My Lai Massacre. In March 1968, a company of American soldiers brutally killed hundreds of unarmed civilians, including women and children, in the hamlet of My Lai. The incident was covered up by the military for over a year before investigative journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story. The details of the massacre shocked the conscience of the world and fueled the anti-war movement's argument that the war was morally bankrupt. It raised disturbing questions about the dehumanizing nature of the conflict and the breakdown of discipline. Richard Nixon won the presidency in 1968 on a promise to restore law and order and to achieve peace with honor in Vietnam. His strategy, known as Vietnamization, aimed to gradually withdraw American combat troops while building up the capacity of the South Vietnamese military to fight the war on their own. Nixon believed this would allow the United States to extricate itself from the conflict without the appearance of a defeat. However, while he reduced troop levels, he also expanded the war by secretly bombing communist sanctuaries in neighboring Cambodia. The invasion of Cambodia in 1970 sparked a new wave of protests on college campuses across the United States. At Kent State University in Ohio, the National Guard was called in to suppress the demonstrations. On May 4th, the Guardsmen opened fire on the students, killing 4 and wounding 9 others. The image of a young woman screaming over the body of a fallen student became an iconic symbol of the domestic tragedy caused by the war. The killings at Kent State shocked the nation and led to strikes at hundreds of universities, forcing many to close early for the semester. As the war dragged on, the morale of the American troops remaining in Vietnam began to deteriorate. Drug use became widespread as soldiers sought escape from the boredom and terror of their daily lives. Racial tensions mirrored the civil rights struggles back home, leading to conflicts within the ranks. The practice of fragging, where enlisted men would attack their own officers with grenades, became a disturbing trend. The army that had marched into Vietnam with pride in 1965 was now showing signs of fracture and disillusionment. In 1971, the New York Times began publishing the Pentagon Papers, a top-secret Department of Defense study of the United States' political and military involvement in Vietnam. Leaked by military analyst Daniel Ellsberg, the documents revealed that 4 successive presidencies had misled the public about the scope and intentions of the war. They showed that the government had secretly expanded the war to Cambodia and Laos, and had known early on that the war was likely unwinnable. The publication of the papers confirmed the worst suspicions of the anti-war movement and further eroded trust in the government. By 1972, the majority of American ground troops had been withdrawn, leaving the South Vietnamese army to bear the brunt of the fighting. The North Vietnamese launched the Easter Offensive, a massive conventional invasion that tested the success of Vietnamization. American air power played a crucial role in halting the advance, with President Nixon ordering Operation Linebacker to bomb targets in North Vietnam. The offensive resulted in heavy casualties on both sides and demonstrated that the war was far from over despite the American withdrawal. Peace negotiations in Paris had been stalling for years over issues such as the status of prisoners of war and the political future of South Vietnam. Henry Kissinger, the national security advisor, engaged in secret talks with North Vietnamese representative Le Duc Tho. In late 1972, Kissinger famously announced that peace is at hand. However, the talks broke down, leading Nixon to order the Christmas bombings, the heaviest air raids of the entire war. The destruction was intended to force the North back to the negotiating table and to reassure the South of continued American support. Finally, in January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, ending direct United States military involvement in Vietnam. The agreement called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of all American troops, and the return of prisoners of war. For the American public, it brought a sense of relief that the long nightmare was finally ending. The returning POWs were welcomed home as heroes, a rare moment of unity in a divided nation. However, for the Vietnamese, the war continued as the Accords failed to resolve the fundamental political struggle between North and South. The United States withdrawal left South Vietnam vulnerable. Although Nixon had promised continued financial and military aid, the Watergate scandal and his subsequent resignation in 1974 weakened the American commitment. Congress slashed funding for the South Vietnamese military, leaving them with shortages of fuel and ammunition. Morale in the South plummeted as corruption and incompetence plagued the government in Saigon. The balance of power shifted decisively in favor of the North, which continued to rebuild its forces for a final push. In early 1975, the North Vietnamese army launched a major offensive in the Central Highlands. The South Vietnamese defense collapsed more rapidly than anyone had predicted. President Gerald Ford asked Congress for emergency aid to stabilize the situation, but the request was denied. The American people and their representatives had no appetite for re-engaging in a war that they considered finished. City after city fell to the communist forces as the South Vietnamese army disintegrated in a chaotic retreat. By late April 1975, the North Vietnamese forces were on the outskirts of Saigon. The airport was under artillery fire, making fixed-wing evacuations impossible. The United States initiated Operation Frequent Wind, the largest helicopter evacuation in history. Marine pilots flew back and forth from offshore aircraft carriers to the embassy roof and other designated points in the city. They rescued thousands of Americans and at-risk Vietnamese citizens, while desperate crowds clamored at the embassy gates begging for salvation. The images of the fall of Saigon were seared into the global consciousness. Helicopters were pushed off the decks of aircraft carriers to make room for incoming flights. The North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the Independence Palace on April 30, 1975. The flag of the Viet Cong was raised, signaling the end of the Republic of Vietnam. The war that had consumed millions of lives and divided the world was finally over. The United States had suffered its first clear defeat in its military history. The aftermath of the war created a massive refugee crisis. Hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese who had worked with the Americans or feared communist reprisals fled the country. Many took to the sea in overcrowded and unseaworthy vessels, earning them the name Boat People. They faced storms, pirates, and starvation in their desperate bid for freedom. The United States and other Western nations eventually resettled over 1 million Vietnamese refugees, fundamentally changing the demographics of communities across America. For the 3 million Americans who served in Vietnam, the return home was often a bitter experience. Unlike the veterans of World War II who were celebrated with ticker tape parades, Vietnam veterans were often met with indifference or open hostility. They were sometimes blamed for the policies of the government and the conduct of the war. Many struggled to reintegrate into a society that wanted to forget the conflict. The lack of public recognition and support exacerbated the psychological wounds of those who had witnessed the horrors of combat. The war left a legacy of physical and mental health issues that would persist for decades. Thousands of veterans suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition that was poorly understood at the time. Others faced health problems related to exposure to Agent Orange, a toxic herbicide used to defoliate the jungle. The struggle for proper medical care and compensation from the Veterans Administration became a long battle for many. The war followed them home, living on in their bodies and their nightmares. The social impact of the Vietnam War on the United States was transformative. It shattered the consensus of the Cold War era and fostered a deep cynicism toward government authority. The credibility gap that opened during the Johnson administration permanently altered the relationship between the press, the presidency, and the public. The war also spurred the passage of the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting age to 18, based on the argument that those old enough to be drafted should be old enough to vote. In an effort to prevent future presidents from dragging the country into undeclared wars, Congress passed the War Powers Act in 1973. The legislation requires the president to notify Congress within 48 hours of committing armed forces to military action, and forbids armed forces from remaining for more than 60 days without a declaration of war. While its effectiveness has been debated, it stands as a legislative monument to the desire to check executive power in the wake of the Vietnam disaster. The so-called Vietnam Syndrome defined American foreign policy for the next 2 decades. It was a reluctance to intervene militarily in foreign conflicts for fear of getting bogged down in another quagmire. This hesitation influenced decisions in Grenada, Lebanon, and Central America. It was not until the Persian Gulf War in 1991 that the United States would again commit a massive ground force to an overseas conflict, declaring that the ghosts of Vietnam had finally been exorcised. Healing began slowly. In 1982, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was dedicated in Washington, D.C. Designed by Maya Lin, the wall lists the names of the more than 58,000 Americans who died or went missing in the conflict. Its polished black granite reflects the faces of the living as they read the names of the dead. The wall became a sacred place for veterans and families to grieve and find closure. It separated the warrior from the war, allowing the nation to honor the sacrifice of the individuals without endorsing the politics of the conflict. Diplomatic relations between the United States and Vietnam were finally normalized in 1995 under President Bill Clinton. Today, the two nations are trading partners, and the old battlefields have become tourist destinations. American veterans often return to Vietnam to meet their former enemies, finding common ground in their shared trauma. The scars of the land have healed over with green rice paddies and bustling cities covering the craters left by the bombs. The Vietnam War remains a cautionary tale about the limits of power and the complexity of global politics. It taught a painful lesson that military superiority does not guarantee political victory, and that nationalism is a force that cannot easily be suppressed. The whispers of that time still echo in current debates about intervention and the duty of a democracy to its soldiers. It stands as a somber reminder of the human cost of war and the enduring resilience of the human spirit in the face of tragedy.